Okay, welcome everyone. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the screen of our viewers on the web. So welcome everyone to the Portland State University Trek Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Jennifer Dill, Professor of Urban Settings and Planning and Director of Trek, and I am doing our introduction today. A couple logistical things before I do the introduction. Some of you in here are students getting credit for this, and so the sign-in sheet for that will be going around. So the sign-in sheet that's going around is intended for the students enrolled for PhD credit. If you're signing up for AICT credits, there was the sign-in sheet when you first walked in. And then my other a couple other logistical things. We are webcast. When we get to the Q&A, there is just an overhead mic that will record your questions. So that is very nice. We don't have to run around with the microphone anymore. And then there is a class in here in this room that starts 10 minutes after we're done. So as much as I would love everyone to linger and chat and have questions, there's another class that leaves the room. So when we're done at 12:30, I'm going to ask you to walk out the door and linger in the lovely new renovated building we have here. It's much nicer out there. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Michael Manville. He's an associate professor of urban planning at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. He is also a faculty affiliate at UCLA's Institute of Transportation Studies and its Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. He has a master's and PhD in urban planning from UCLA, and also before joining UCLA as faculty, he was an assistant professor of city and regional planning at Cornell University. I'm very excited that he made the trip up here to share some of his work on equity and congestion pricing, which, judging from the room and the number of people online, is a topic of great interest. So,
thank you. Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So what I'm going to do today is, as Jennifer mentioned, I think there's a lot of interest now in congestion pricing, much more so than when I first started doing this work. And as people start talking about maybe adopting some form of congestion pricing in U.S. cities, one of the big issues that comes about is whether it would be a fair thing to do. And so the plan of this, I think I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. I will first just kind of run through the basic logic behind congestion pricing so we all understand like why, from an efficiency perspective, transportation analysts like it, and then talk a little bit more about the equity implications of it. One thing I'll say before I start is that right as I was leaving for here, I got the suggestion that my PowerPoint might be ugly. So I was like, I just do what people tell me at the Institute of Transportation Studies. And about a year ago, someone was like, you're using the wrong PowerPoint template. And they sent me a template. And so I did it. And then I gave a talk using this template on like Tuesday. And as I was leaving that talk, our director of communications was like, I need to do something about your template. And I said, okay. But so I'm not an aesthetically gifted person. If this is an ugly PowerPoint, my apologies in advance. But I just, yeah. So with that, so I think where we start with this idea of using prices to manage congestion comes from an assumption that people like me have that traffic congestion, the basic source of it is that it's a price distortion. Sometimes you talk to people and you say, why do we have traffic congestion? And people will say it's because not enough people ride transit, it's because not enough people work from home, it's because not enough people bicycle. But ultimately, the way someone like me thinks about this is that traffic congestion arises because we don't adequately price vehicle travel at busy times. And there's a few different ways to think about this. I think if you ever take like a transportation economics class, the version you learn is when you get on a busy road, you don't properly take into account how much you are going to slow other people down, right? So that when I pull onto the 405 in the morning in Los Angeles, what I'm thinking to myself is, this is the fastest way for me to get where I'm going, even though it's a pain in the neck. What I don't think to myself is, there's like 100 other people on this road right now. I'm going to slow all of them down by 4 seconds by pulling onto the road. And since we're all doing that to each other, everyone's trip is going to be 10 minutes longer, right? That's kind of a not very intuitive way to think about it, though. I think two more intuitive ways to think about it are that roads are one of the only systems of infrastructure we have that we don't meter, right? Almost all of you probably have gas and electric and water service in your homes, and they're all metered. As soon as you use them, you start paying. We don't do that with roads, and not coincidentally, this is the only form of infrastructure we have that we regularly run out of, right? And a third way to think about it, which is I'm going to dwell on a little bit, is just that roads are literally very valuable land. And we don't price that land, and as a result, we end up with shortages of it. And so one way to think about this is here's Manhattan, New York. You know, anyone who's been there knows a sort of unparalleled combination of social and cultural and economic opportunities, daytime population in the millions. Here's Manhattan, Kansas, which is different. It has a university, and according to Wikipedia, its zoo has leopards. So there's more here than here, and that mostly shows up if you want to live or work there, right? So the median price of a home in Manhattan, New York is about $1.5 million. In Manhattan, Kansas, it's a little under $200,000. If you wanted to open office there, commercial rent's about $72 a square foot here. It's about $12 a square foot in Manhattan, Kansas. And this is all pretty obvious, right? Real estate prices are determined by location. Location is what gives you value. This entirely breaks down, though, if you want to drive across Manhattan, New York, because that costs nothing, right? And if you want to drive across Manhattan, Kansas, that costs nothing, right? If you just think about occupying space in these two places, right, in any way except when you're in a car, the price that you pay reflects the value that that place gives you. And that's not true when we choose to drive. And so what we've done is we've divorced the price of this road space from its value. Right, it's much more valuable to be on the road in Manhattan because Manhattan offers you many more opportunities than in this Manhattan, right? But because we have basically held the price down to zero and always zero, right? It costs nothing to drive into Manhattan at midday when a lot's going on, and at midnight when much less is going on, not nothing. And so that what we basically have, I live in California. We have giant arguments in California all the time about whether we should have rent control for housing. What we don't talk about is the fact that we run a giant rent control program for cars, right? Because the land for cars is held down at a zero price all the time. And I teach economics in our department at UCLA, and so one thing I always tell my students that they may or may not internalize is that when you have a price control system, you're going to have four consequences, right? One of them is you get a shortage, right? You run out of the good if you hold its price down. And a traffic jam is just a shortage of road. That's all that's happening. It's a long moving queue because the demand has outstripped the supply. The second thing that happens when you hold the price down is you get what's called high search costs, which is that people have to spend, because of the shortage, people have to spend a lot of extra energy finding the good they're looking for. The best example of this, right, is something like Waze. That you would never need an app on your phone to tell you how to get from one place to another if the most obvious way to get from that place to another place wasn't in a shortage or in congestion, right? That the only reason Waze has such a huge following in LA is because the major roads are always blocked, right? So that's a sign of high search costs. The fact that someone can start a business telling you how to move around and avoid traffic. The third is misallocation, right? When you hold the price of something down to zero, it's going to be used by people who value it a lot and people who value it a little because the price is nothing, right? Or the price is just time. And so we know anyone who's looked at census commuting data or a travel diary data more specifically from like the National Household Travel Survey, one of the most surprising findings that keeps coming up is that even at like 8 a.m. on a freeway, a substantial share and sometimes a majority of people are not going to school or work, right? They're taking relatively low value trips, right? That because the price of the road is so low. So one way I like to think about this is in a place like where I'm from, LA County, it has like 9 million people. Probably on a regular basis, there is someone on their way to give birth who is being slowed down by someone on their way to buy potato chips, right? Because the price, one of them would pay almost anything to be going faster, and the other one could care less, right? But because the road costs nothing, they're both there. And the last thing we get with a price control is what are called shadow markets, which is to say that when you hold the price of something down legislatively, you don't make the cost of that go away. It just shows up somewhere else. And so with traffic congestion, because we don't pay for the roads in money, in part, of course, we pay for them in time, right? We all sort of queue up. But the other thing that happens is that our concern about congestion spills into other parts of our policy. And so the big example of this, I think in most coastal cities, certainly on the West Coast, is that when you go to build anything, right, suddenly it is the responsibility of property developers to fight congestion. So that if we go to build housing in Los Angeles, there's a huge book of guidelines that planners give the developers saying, like, you have to do the following 5 or 6 things to mitigate the effects of traffic congestion. On top of that, you have to provide all sorts of parking spaces, right, to make sure that the transportation impacts of whatever you're building are minimized. This is an example of taking a policy that should be being dealt with on the road. That's where this is happening. Because we don't want to deal with it on the road, we dump it into the property market. And so we get, in addition to all our traffic congestion, we have more problems building housing, which contributes to our housing crisis. So that's a classic shadow market. So what that ends up, and shadow markets, of course, I should just mention, can become black markets. There aren't too many black markets in roads because we don't, it's harder to do, but street parking spaces, we often keep them free as well. With the arrival of sort of the app-based industry, one thing that has happened in cities across the country, right, is that people have figured out that actually the value of our street parking spaces is much higher than the price the city charges for them. And so there have been different companies over the last 10 years that have tried to basically resell public parking spaces at their actual market price. So companies in San Francisco and Boston, they'll just send someone out, you can sit in a space, you realize that space is actually worth $20 an hour, and then you sell it. That's illegal, right? You can't sell things you don't own. And so these companies get shut down, which is appropriate, but it should be a sign to those of us who are thinking about transportation policy of how much this land is really worth, right? And why we have so many problems managing it when we keep the price down to zero. Whenever you see a black market in something, you should know that the price of it is somehow wrong, right? And so as we start to see black markets in our transportation infrastructure, it should be even more evidence that we are pricing our transportation infrastructure incorrectly. So that kind of gets to why transportation analysts want to use pricing. I'll give you one more example of this just to take this out of the road and go back to sort of broader infrastructure. That if we have a problem where roads are being overused because we aren't sort of sending the correct price signals, then fixing those price signals should get us toward less overuse of those roads. And there are analogies to this in our other infrastructure. For the most part, we take as given that we pay for our water and our electricity and our heating fuel, and we don't pay for our roads. But every once in a while, you become aware of like a holdout city that just doesn't directly pay for its infrastructure. So as recently as 2003, Sacramento, the capital of California, didn't have water meters, right? Everybody could just use as much water they wanted, and it was like sort of bundled into their property taxes. And so Sacramento used a ton of water compared to the rest of the state. This is because in 1920, the city had a charter amendment that just said, like, no one will ever pay directly for water. And so what was going on, right, is that in all the cities near Sacramento, the average household used 12,700 gallons of water a month, and Sacramento was using 17,000 gallons a month of water. Something similar was happening in Fresno, another city in the valley, right? Fresno residents were using about 290 gallons of water a person per day, which was more than Las Vegas. They didn't have water meters. So then California entered this drought, and people started to rethink this. And so he basically said, that they should start to rethink this. And this is just a nice quote describing an activist who was pushing for water meters and said, without meters, there's no measuring the waste and no cost incentive to conserve. Right, and that's exactly what's going on with our streets right now. That there's no way to measure how much we waste our street space, and there's no incentive for anyone to use our street space more judiciously. Right, it's just infrastructure we aren't managing well. And so both these cities put in meters. And so if you fast forward to 2018, by 2018, 70% of the households had meters, and household water use had fallen down to right around where all its neighbors were. Fresno they had all their meters installed, household water use had fallen to 200 gallons a day from almost 300. That basically just a little bit of a price incentive convinces people to use the resource a little bit more efficiently. And there's no reason not to think a road toll, especially a toll that rose and fell with like the demand for the road, would do something similar. Okay, so, and I think the one big objection that I always hear from that is people say, my God, the toll would have to be like $1 million, right? They look at the 405 or the 10 in Los Angeles and say, there's so many cars on it. We would just have to, you'd have to price so many people off the road. The very quick explanation of this graph, which like, you know, every transportation person loved, this backward bending curve, is just to drive home the point that congestion is not a linear phenomenon. That basically the last few vehicles that get on a road at any given time account for a disproportionate share of the delay, which probably a lot of you can understand if you've ever been driving on a road in the middle of the night and another car gets on it, and now there's only 2 of you on the road. When that guy got on the road, he didn't slow you down. But if that happened at 8 in the morning and one more person got on the road, lots of people react to it. They react to it in different ways. Some people tap their brakes. Some people move over to the other lane. That causes the people behind them to react. Suddenly you have a lot of delay, which means that, you know, you only have to have a toll high enough to get those last few people not onto the road to make the whole road work a lot better. The rule of thumb we sometimes use, which is more or less empirically correct, you could probably argue about the specifics, is like if you got 5% of people not to enter the road at a given time, you'd probably see your speeds go up 15 to 20%. That it's that big of a sort of mismatch. So the toll doesn't have to get everyone off the road. It just has to deter a few people from entering at a particular time. So that's the so what that leads to is a lot of transportation analysts saying, well, if we really want to deal with congestion in our cities, you need to have dynamically priced roads, right? Somehow put a price on road use and ideally make that price higher when more people want to use it, lower when they don't. There's all sorts of objections to this, and we can talk about the whole range of them in the Q&A, I hope. But what I want to talk about here is just sort of that there's basically there's a concern that it's fundamentally unfair. And one thing I want to say at the beginning of this, before I go into some of the fairness objections, is it is accurate to say this is not a policy that would sort of like affirmatively advance equity, right? If you were to just say like, you know, pick a policy that would make the United States a fairer country, I would not say congestion pricing, right? It's an efficiency strategy. Our roads are inefficient. They don't work well because they're allocated inefficiently. We can fix that. And it can be done in ways, I hope to convince you, that don't exacerbate equity problems, right? And it could even make the societies fairer along some dimensions, but it doesn't directly address like the most fundamental inequities in the transportation system, right? So that's just a caveat, which is to make sure we're on the same page. I am not saying that this is the policy you want to do if you just want to have like an absolutely fairer system. I'm saying this will make the system better and it doesn't have to make it less fair, right? And I think it does pair well, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, with a lot of policies that would make our system much fairer. So the two fairness objections that come up, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one and much more on this one. One is that people say this is unfair because it's double taxation, right? If you put a toll on the road, we've already paid for these roads with the gas tax, with our registration fees, things like that. The other one is to say that this is unfair because a congestion charge is regressive, by which I mean because it's a flat charge, its burden rises as income falls. This is a more substantive objection that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, but I do want to address this one really quickly. So do we already pay for the roads? Yes, but we don't pay to use them, right? We pay gas taxes, we pay registration fees, we pay some other charges. Almost all of those are just there to provide the roads, right? If you pay a fuel tax and someone uses the fuel tax to build a road, that's provision. The toll, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A, is an instrument of allocation, right? It's to say that are we charging a price that makes the road actually perform better, right? As opposed to just like, have we charged you a price to make sure the road exists? And so the gas tax doesn't go up when more people want to use the road, and it doesn't go down when fewer people want to. So it doesn't really reflect demand for the road. And that's because it's not a charge for using the road. It's a charge for burning gas, right? And so you can use the road a lot. Well, I'll put it this way, you could pay a lot of gas tax with never using the road, right? You could just buy this Hummer, leave it running in your driveway. You'll pay a ton of gas tax and you'll have zero road use. Conversely, you could use the road a lot and never pay the gas tax. You could buy this electric Hummer and drive it all over the place, and you would cause all sorts of congestion and you would pay nothing in gas tax. I don't think this actually exists yet, so maybe a more realistic example is this Tesla, but you get the idea, right? We pay a lot of charges like around road use. That's what registration fees are, that's what gas taxes are, but we don't pay any charges to directly use the road. And that's a small difference, but when it comes to congestion, it makes all the difference, right? So this is what would make the congestion go away, is actually tolling the demand for the road. Okay, so let's talk, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A if anyone is disagreeing in the audience. In terms of the second objection, which is like, would this be unfair to low-income people? Here we have to tease things out a bit more. There's no question that tolls are regressive charges, right? If you just like, London has a congestion charge, it's about $12. That $12 is much bigger burden to someone who only makes $20,000 than it is to someone who makes $200,000. So you can concede that, and then you have to say, well, is it automatically the case that something that's regressive is unfair? And then, regardless of the answer to that, is there a way you can mitigate the unfairness? And I think the answer to this is no, yes, right? Like, plenty of regressive charges are fair, and to the extent there is unfairness, we can probably fix it. And so let's walk through that. There's basically, I think there's two ways you can think about fairness or equity, right? One is what's like called the ability to pay principle, which is basically like, if you have more, you pay more. And the other one is the user pays principle, which is that people should not consume resources and shunt the cost of those resources onto others. These are both perfectly sensible definitions of equity. They also conflict with each other, right? A congestion charge conforms to this one and violates that one, right? And so what we want to do if we want to price our roads is figure out a way to sort of reconcile the tension that's embedded between these two conceptions of equity. But the important point that I want to drive home here is that free roads violate both of these, right? When the road is free, people who have more don't pay more. No one pays anything. And it's certainly true that when the road is free, people who use it don't pay for the cost they're responsible for. So it's important not just to think about what this would mean measured against some abstract conception of fairness, but also measured against what we do now, right? And so I'm going to take us on a little bit of a detour where I explain to you, or hope to convince you, that free roads, the status quo we have, are actually profoundly unfair, right? And then think about pricing in that context, right? Free roads are a subsidy for affluent people. They're a subsidy for affluent people because driving is expensive. Like, you need to get a car, you need to get insurance. The more you want to drive, the more fuel you're going to burn, the faster the time is going to come when your car needs maintenance and maybe even to be replaced, right? That's not to say that low-income people don't do a lot of driving. They do. It's to say that high-income people do much more driving, right? And these are data from, you could look at the census, the commuting data, or you could look at the National Household Travel Survey, just like who's on the road on freeways at peak hours. And what it basically shows you in both cases is that low-income people are underrepresented on the roads relative to their population, and high-income people are overrepresented. So if you are thinking about a way to help low-income people, keeping roads free is a very poorly targeted way to do that, right? The way to think about keeping roads free is that it's something that helps higher-income people, and some lower-income people benefit from it. But the lowest-income people don't drive at all, right? And so if you want to hold the price of something down to help low-income people, you should hold down the price of things low-income people disproportionately use. That's one reason we hold down transit fare prices. Driving doesn't fit this bill. I think that keeping roads free is less a progressive transfer. It looks less like a sort of welfare payment, and it's more of a matching grant, right? A matching grant is a grant where the government gives you something if you produce something first. And with a road, you only benefit from it if you can first produce a car and gas and insurance, right? And matching grants, by definition, are more useful to people who have more money. And so maybe we want to keep the roads free, but we shouldn't pretend that this is a way to help low-income people, because you only get the benefit if you can afford a car. In addition to that, when we keep the roads free, the roads become congested, and when the roads become congested, the cars on them pollute more, which means that there's a lot of costs that are borne by people who live near congested roads. This is a huge problem where I'm from in Los Angeles, because almost all of our roads are congested and we have a hard time building things. And so we end up building a lot near congested roads. The costs of this are, in terms of public health, are substantial. I won't walk all the way through this, but you can see that motor vehicles, they emit carbon monoxide, air toxics, fine and ultrafine particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, hydrocarbons. This is even just setting aside all the global warming implications. All of these things within a very local scale, right, ranging from 1,000, 300 to 400 meters, have profound health consequences. This is not something electric cars will solve, right? Electric cars make some of this go away, but electric cars are really heavy, right? Particulate matter comes not just from engines, it also comes from when you step on the brakes, right? And when you have friction between your tires and the pavement. A Tesla Model X emits far more particulate matter than an internal combustion vehicle, right? We have to also make our roads move more quickly if we really want to fight this. So very quickly, just to show you that this isn't just a function of the fact that there are cars with engines on roads, but actually that they are congested. This is a graph from when the New Jersey Turnpike at the New York-New Jersey border switched from toll booths to Easy Pass. And so when it did this, it went from having long queues at toll booths to congestion going down quite a bit because people were just gliding under the toll gantry. Researchers at Columbia noticed, right, or they did a study and found that as you got further from the closer you were to a toll booth after this change was made, the incidence of premature birth went way down, right? And then the same thing happens with time as well. That basically what was happening is that premature birth is a caused by carbon monoxide in part. It's the same with low weight birth. That as the congestion dried up, the amount of particulate matter and carbon monoxide filtering away from the congestion went down. Mothers, right, who lived near the expectant mothers who lived near the road were no longer ingesting this poison, and so the incidence of preterm birth, which is the leading cause of infant mortality in the U.S., declined sharply, right? So we don't think about this because we tend to think about congestion as a problem we deal with as drivers, but the people who live near the roads literally breathe our poison, right? And it's in part because we don't price them. So that's a profound equity impact that we often don't consider. Now, who are these folks? I mean, I probably don't have to really convince you. People who live near very, very close to congested roads tend to be poor, but I'm going to convince you anyways. So a really simple way to do this is to just map all the freeways in the nation's 10 most congested urban areas. And then you can just draw a 1,000-foot buffer around those freeways, and then look at census block groups. And a co-author of mine did this. We just had two different categorizations. I won't walk through this in too much detail, but if the block group is more than 75% covered by the freeway buffer, we call it freeway dominated. If it just touches the block group, we call it freeway intersected. The short version of this, right, is this. These are the 10 most congested urbanized areas. I have a bigger graph that shows this in more detail, but if you can just look at the difference in the poverty shares of the freeway dominated and the census block groups in the same urbanized areas that have no freeways, the differences are substantial, and the average difference is about 65% more likely to be poor. And these are really areas of concentrated disadvantage. That the dominated block groups are in these urbanized areas well under 1% of the land area. They hold less than 2% of the population, but about 4% of all the low-income people in those urban areas. So it's not that they hold all the low-income people, it's that low-income people are disproportionately likely to be there. This is a bigger look at that, right? That basically, if you look at who's near freeways, you're much more likely to be in poverty, and then importantly, you're also much more likely not to have a vehicle. So you have a group of people who are, by virtue of their low income status, much more likely to be breathing the fumes of people on the freeway, and much less likely to be benefiting from the transportation benefits of the freeway because they don't even have a car, right? And so I won't belabor this too much more, other than to say, in fact, this was not a very useful graph table to put up. That text is tiny. These people are also much less likely to be white, right? They're much more likely to be racial minorities. And this is just to drive this home again, the differences across some of these urban areas in vehicle ownership. I just want to show you some of if you break it down rather than just the averages. In Atlanta, people who live right near freeways are over 3 times as likely not to have a car. In Boston, almost 3 times as likely. Seattle, 266% more likely. These are folks who are not benefiting from the facilities that they are getting pollution from. So I hope that what that shows you is that we can at least think twice about how fair it is to have a free system. Now back to my initial question, would pricing really be any better? I think, again, the main criticism you have to contend with is this idea that the price is regressive. And so we've been talking about this down in Southern California. Sort of a neighborhood official summarized this very well. He says, what's prohibitively expensive for someone of limited means is a drop in the bucket for the affluent. Sometimes this is expressed as the concern that if we had priced roads, we would have Lexus lanes, that only the lawyers could use them driving around in their Lexuses. And so I think one way to sort of rephrase this is to say, well, is it wrong to levy a regressive charge for access to an essential good like a road? And I think the answer is no, just because we do it all the time. And I will give you some examples. So some examples of regressive charges for essential goods. Transit fares are regressive. Doesn't matter how much money you make riding the transit in LA is $1.75. Sales taxes for transit, which a lot of us like, are highly regressive, right? We vote on these ballot measures to use sales taxes to fund transit, super regressive tax. Gasoline is regressive, so are gas taxes. Cars, so as we're talking about the transportation system, that's a regressive good. Our water and electric meters are regressive charges, and most of our food is charged regressively. So the point isn't, right, that none of these things has ever created a burden for anyone. They have. There's people in our country who can't afford their food, they can't afford their water, they can't afford their electric meters. But almost no one that I know of thinks that the solution to this is to make all of these things free for everyone all the time, right? Instead, we have a food stamp program that identifies people with low income and helps them buy food. We have lifeline services for utilities that helps people afford their electricity. But the impulse with roads is to say, no, some people might have a hard time paying this, so we should never charge for them ever. That makes roads very unique in our sort of spectrum of the way we think about social welfare. And I don't think it makes a ton of sense, because we sacrifice a lot of efficiency and the ability to help people who might need help, because we don't collect any revenue, right? So the real nature of the concern we should have about congestion pricing is this, that every metropolitan area is going to have some low-income drivers with few obvious alternatives to using busy roads at busy times, with people that we would say have very high adaptation costs. Not only would they have a hard time paying the toll, but they don't live near transit, or the nature of their job means they can't take it. They have a longer trip, they can't ride a bike, or the bike would be dangerous, etc. These are the folks we have to worry about. And what I'm going to say is that this is a manageable problem. It's not that it's not a problem, because it is. But I think sometimes the discussion about pricing goes a little bit off the rails. I didn't mean to make a pun, and I guess I just did. Because people think about that and they say, oh, we can solve that by giving the money to transit, because low-income people tend to use transit a lot. And so that's coming up down in Southern California, where we talk about this, and then people at our metro agency say, if we take all this money, we can make transit free, right? The trouble, right, is that, remember, the nature of the unfairness is low-income drivers with few alternatives. If you take all the toll revenue and give it to transit, that doesn't solve that problem. Just put yourself in the shoes of someone who's like a landscaper. You have to drive to work. Suddenly there's a congestion toll. You're paying $4, and you'd probably be paying it electronically, but imagine you're handing it to somebody and saying, this is really unfair. And they're like, don't worry, we're building a new bus line across town. No, like giving the money to transit might be a good idea, or some of it, and it might be progressive in the sense that like you would be transferring money from a group that is on average affluent to on average less affluent. But it doesn't solve the specific harm. And so you have to keep your eye on the prize, which is to say like, this is going to raise a lot of money if we do it. You could spend most of it in almost any way you want, right? But some of it has to be held back to help this group, because this is the group you're going to hurt, right? So it's always remembering like that identifying who's going to be harmed and making sure you make them whole, then do whatever you want with the revenue, right? And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. We have plenty of examples of this, right, of ways to do this, right? So we have Lifeline phone service in California where everyone pays for their phone service. Some of the money goes to people who can't afford it. We do it with our utilities, right? That most of us pay for things. We help out the folks who can't. And of course, the SNAP program is like the essential model for this. You could argue, I would agree, most of these programs should be more generous, but there's a model in place for doing it. Okay, so I think, how much time do I have?
Almost 6.
So
about 14 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And then we'll do 10 minutes of Q&A.
That's fine, yeah.
Okay.
And I could probably make it faster than 14. So I'll just make a really quick point here, which is to say that one thing, if you're someone like me who dorks out about this stuff, the fact that we don't have a market in roads at all is kind of exciting, because it means you can design one, and when you can design a market rather than just intervene in an existing one, you can build in a lot of proactive fairness considerations, right? And that's one of the things that's hard about sort of like getting involved in the labor market and trying to redistribute income. It's like it's already there and it's already set in its ways. And I think there's 3 ways people kind of think about doing this. One is to grant some people exemptions. One is to do like a program of gradualism, and the other is like straightforward redistribution. This is the most tempting one, I think, and I'm going to argue that these are a little bit better. And I'm going to try and do this quickly because I do want to leave time for Q&A. The only thing to say about exemptions is that they're appealing initially because you're like, I'm worried about this group. They don't have to pay. That comes back to haunt you because you just don't know what's going to happen down the road. A really quick example of this is that when London did its congestion charge, it exempted taxi cabs. And it knew exactly how many taxi cabs were in the city. And then someone invented Uber. And that caused a problem. And they couldn't have anticipated that, right? But it's like suddenly there was this thing and it qualifies as a cab and there's a lot more exempt vehicles. This is just a graph from some research I did years ago. California decided that it would exempt anyone who had a disability placard from paying at a parking meter, which seems sensible at the time. And now there is a cottage industry in people getting disability placards so they don't have to pay for parking. And we've done some surveys from downtown Los Angeles, what's happened over the day in some of the most prime parking spots in LA. And the blue is just people who occupied spaces and minutes with disability placards. And the much smaller brown is where people actually paid for parking. And we had surveyors just sit there for 12 hours and watch this, and it was amazing, right? Like the guy like pulled up in a van, hung a placard, got out, pulled a dolly out of the van, bounced it down some stairs, unloaded some boxes. That it's it's very hard. It seems easy at the beginning. It's hard to police. It breeds some fraud. It breeds mistrust, etc. I can talk more about that. A very nice thing about roads is that, especially freeways, like you have multiple lanes, right? So I think one of the best ways to ease concerns about fairness, especially in places where we would price actually freeways, is to literally do it 1 or 2 lanes at a time. That in many parts of the country we have some high occupancy toll lanes, right? 1 or 2 lanes where you can pay a toll and go a little bit faster. Rather than try and push something that's like, now all our roads are priced, I think it would be much better to say, next year, this lane is also priced, right? And we add some more price lanes on some other lanes. And then in 3 years, this lane is priced. And then in 5 years, this lane is priced. And what this does is it sort of demonstrates to people the benefit and also that it's not going to be terrible, but it also gives you a built-in transition period where there is always a free option. Right? If someone really can't afford it and really feels like they can't move around, for like the first few years until we sort of catch up to speed and see what the problems are, you still have that free option. I think this is something a lot of metropolitan areas should think about. And then lastly is just like, even with that, you want to take some of the money, as I mentioned, and somehow give it back to people who you're worried about. This could take different forms. The ideal for someone like me is just to have a lump sum payment delivered to everybody in the metropolitan area who's below a certain income. Those things aren't popular. It's administratively difficult. I can try and defend it more in the Q&A if you want. Perhaps more feasible is just to have a toll transponder that's preloaded with money that's given to people who qualify under a certain income. That's a lot more manageable. There's all sorts of other options as well. You could do some sort of rebate, like an earned income tax credit, et cetera, et cetera. Main point being there's ways we can do it. And so I'll just leave with a thought experiment, and then I'll be done. I think that one way to think about the fairness of pricing is just to imagine a world where today all the freeways were priced, right? Like my ideal world. All the freeways are priced, you have much less congestion and pollution. As a result, you've got more transit ridership, and you've got some revenue that's used to help low-income folks, and the remainder is paid for some public goods. And then someone comes along and proposes making the roads free. They come into a seminar like this, and they're like, I have an idea, free roads. Would we consider that fair, right? That basically what we would probably think to ourselves is, well, this would help some low-income people, but it would really just help a lot of rich people. The road system wouldn't work as well. We'd have more congestion, we'd have more pollution, and we'd lose all this revenue, not only for public goods, but like for all the harm that would be caused. Because now, instead of paying for roads in money, which we can reinvest, we're just going to be paying for them in time. And the thing about time is that once you spend it, it's just gone forever. Like we can't reuse it, right? And so one way to think about it again is just like, how would you feel if someone came in and just like said, we should abolish electric meters or water meters? Because it's essentially the same thing. And most of us would probably think that would march against most of our goals socially and environmentally and so forth. And so I think if you think about it that way, the case for this maybe makes a little bit more sense. But I'm done. I told you everything I know. Do I take my own questions or?
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, please.
I was thinking about the concern of like the landscaper and the cost pass on to him, but
yeah,
I mean, it seems like he could just raise the cost of his service, which would.
Yeah, I mean, I think landscapers are an interesting. They're sort of the classic idea because they don't necessarily make a lot of money. They really do have to be in their truck and so forth. It's possible that they could pass on the cost. It's possible that they would also, at least many of the workers fall under an income threshold to where they would qualify for some rebates. But the other thing to remember is that a toll would reduce the income of a landscape. But so does congestion, right? Because you can't be like a nice thing about being a professor is that like if I fall behind in my work, I go home and I can work till like 11 p.m. I don't like doing it, but I could. You can't like fit in an extra job as a landscaper by showing up at 11 p.m. right? So what that means that the more time you spend traveling between jobs, you're losing money. And so there are at least some landscaping firms for whom it would be better to be able to you fit in an extra job and actually make more money. So I think it's important to remember. So I agree, like there's ways they could pass it on, but it is also important to remember that for a lot of these folks who can't work flexible hours, like knowledge workers, congestion takes a huge bite out of what they earn because they're between jobs not making money. Yeah.
Has anyone attempted a pricing scheme where the toll was variable by income?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's probably not. It's probably similar to just rebating money to people based on income, but like it's easier to do that after the fact. I think the closest thing I can think of would be the sort of the fine systems they have in Scandinavia where you're pulled over by the police and then, but like these are small homogenous countries with a lot of centralized government control. So like literally the police officer can look up your income. And that's, a metropolitan planning organization in the US just has no way of knowing your income. Yeah. Yes.
So the tolling idea, the road use fee, congested areas, that's the main argument. So we got states like Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, who have majority of state, there's no congestion.
Mhm.
So do we toll those roads, those interstates and freeways?
So, I mean, congestion pricing is a very specific form of the broader category of road pricing. And I think that sometimes, increasingly, you're hearing an argument that we should have flat VMT charges, right, to help finance the road system, right? So it wouldn't be to reduce congestion necessarily. It would just be like, we need to pay for this giant road system, and we have a lot of road surface area in these rural areas. The gas tax doesn't buy what it used to. Maybe we should anticipate a future where, as more and more electric cars come, the gas tax will buy even less. So let's switch to a system where we just charge by mile driven. I don't really have a dog in that fight. I can see the logic of it, but there's drawbacks too, right? Especially if you're talking about replacing the gas tax, right? Because I don't want to just charge a Hummer by mile driven and then suddenly not account for all the fuel it burns. But I think that it would, a VMT charge would just be for a very different purpose. It's usually just to sort of raise some revenue and reduce driving at the margin a little bit, but they are kind of different things. Yes.
A question from online. If we find a way to price our use of driving on, use of driving on roads, are there models for incentivizing use of alternate and less damaging congestive models of transportation? For example, I bike most days and drive some depending on the trip. Can I get a credit of some sort for the days I don't drive? I think this would help get people out of their cars and try alternatives.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the nice thing about a congestion charge is the credit you get on the days you don't drive is you don't pay the toll. And then, but to sort of, if you wanted to double down on it, like one thing I mentioned when I talked about redistribution was this idea of like a lump sum payment back to people below a certain income threshold. I suppose you could do a lump sum payment in general, is if you just sort of build that as a transportation allowance, right? Then people could say like, oh, well, I could use this money to pay for my toll, but I could also, if I didn't drive and just walked, I would just have money, right? And so that might be one way to get at it. You had a question?
With your example of the freeway, specifically congestion pricing, and I do think if this happened, it would happen on freeways first. What stays have there been as far as like that increasing traffic on other arterials and potentially,
Right.
People still want to drive fast, but on.
So the question of whether, if I'm hearing you right, like if you priced a freeway, would you just get a lot of spillover onto the nearby streets because people would try to avoid the toll? Yeah, so I guess there's two ways to think about that. There is some evidence that happens, but again, like that happens when the roads are free too. Like if you drive next to the 405 on Sepulveda Boulevard in Los Angeles, like the neighborhoods are just full of spill-off traffic. I think if you put a price on a road, remember that you have this nonlinear function, right? And so there is some evidence that, and this is very counterintuitive, if you limit the pace at which people enter a freeway, you therefore make the entire road function better, and that freeway actually carries more people. And so what that means is that you're actually pulling people off side streets onto the road. And so there's some folks who would be pushed off, but there's also folks who would be pulled on. And so it would mitigate the extent to which you had a lot of spillover traffic on side streets. The big caveat here is that only a handful of places have done things like this. And so this is a combination of like small sample evidence and modeling. The other thing to keep in mind is that the nature of US freeways in particular is people often travel a good distance to get to them and then make their trip. And so one thing that happens is you get on the road and you're driving toward the freeway and then you realize the freeway is incredibly congested. And so then you're just going to drive on a nearby street instead, right? If you wake up that morning knowing that at 8 a.m. that freeway is expensive and you don't want to take it, your second best route might not take you near the freeway at all. And so you might end up driving on a surface street, but not one that's near the freeway, which means that all the spillover might not be concentrated in one place. The final point, right, is that if this really happens, we should just calm those streets, right? Like, I mean, I think this is something that LA is trying to deal with Waze, is just like suddenly there are people commuting home on like these little residential collector streets and no one's sure what to do about it. But I think the thing to do, they want to like blame Waze, and that's fine, but they could also just like put in speed bumps and bollards and return these streets to what they were supposed to be, which is just streets people live on. Oh, there's so many hands. All right, yes. Yeah, you. I'm going kind of randomly here. I don't mean to leave anyone out, but.
Great presentation, thanks so much. I'm interested in if you've done any work or if you know of any work on sort of the behavioral psychology part of this. And I really like your analogy of this to like water metering or electricity metering. But I think that, you know, while they're similar, we pay our electricity or water bill once a month or once a quarter, whereas this would be something that's kind of in your face every day. And I'm interested in how that plays with the psychology.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. We're much more, you know, we're more tolerant of water metering and electric metering, in part just because it's been there for a long time, but in part because it's, while we're aware of it, we're more passively aware of it, right? That, but I think one way to think about this is probably like water metering would be a lot more effective if the meter was just like mounted in the shower. You're just like, oh my God. And I think that because the demand for roads is so high, right, and is so salient, that so uneven, it becomes more important that the charge becomes more salient. And so I think that makes people resistant to it, right? And so this is one reason this has never really gone anywhere for a long time, is that the things that you would need to do to make it very effective, which is like, this is a clear, transparent charge, are the kind of things where like if you say it to an elected official, they're like, I'd rather build a light rail line.
Yeah.
And so yeah, but I think there's a story from Singapore does have priced freeways, and when they switched to credit card payment, they were concerned that the charge would be sufficiently less salient that it wouldn't change people's behavior. And so they now have not just a transponder, but a transponder that as you drive under the gantry, it actually flashes the price at you. Like, you just paid $4. Right? Because otherwise there was a concern that people would just like, you know, they'd realize they'd driven so much at the end of the month and that wouldn't quite do the trick. So yeah, it's a great point. Yes.
I want to ask about the gradualism approach that you brought up, since I haven't seen something like that proposed before. So we're a metro area here where we've got almost no HOV lanes, so there's nothing to convert to HOT lanes.
Right.
And most of our freeways are too right-of-way constrained to build new lanes to manage.
Right.
So if we did something like that here, we're automatically talking about converting general purpose lanes lane by lane, which is not something I'm aware anywhere in the US has done. So to use your thought experiment of, you've got someone who's working as a landscaper, their only option is to drive that road. For years 1 and 2, where you're gradually pricing some of the lanes, while that free lane is technically available, it seems reasonable to assume it is more congested than it was before. So aren't you harming that person in time instead of money for the transition period?
Yeah, but I think that right now, I mean, you probably are. Like, there's no getting around the fact that like some people end up feeling or being worse off as you take something that was free and slowly start to price it. I think that the evidence that the free lane gets more congested is somewhat ambiguous, right? If you look at what's happened in LA or some of the other places that have these HOT lanes, it's sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, right? There's no question that the HOT lane moves a lot more vehicles. It's like more within the confidence interval as to whether the free lanes move less. But I think that, you know, to your broader point, yeah, I mean, I think that nothing about this will be easy, right? And I think that so going, if you don't have an existing HOV lane, then your first step is like 2 lanes of this freeway are going to be priced, right? That's a big lift. There's no question. And I think that if you say that we leave a free option, that is different from saying no one suffers any consequences at all, right? It's just sort of the difference between doing that and saying the whole road is free, or doing what a lot of cities want to do, which is like Manhattan is moving forward with just drawing a cordon around Manhattan. And that's like, no matter what, you pay to get in. There's no free option. And so this is just kind of like a halfway between that. I don't think you can ever get to a point short of really doing a rebate system, which I think you should do, of saying that like, you're all used to this being free, you built your life around this being free, we're going to price it and no one's going to feel inconvenienced. I mean, we're just not going to get there. Yeah. Yes. And then I'll come back to the online. Thank you.
Do you have any work, or have you done any analysis of long-term land use effects in a price environment? Because of course, lower income folks have been pushed further away.
Right.
And now would they change their choices if we have a price environment for transportation?
So, so this, back when I first started thinking about this in grad school, and like this was entirely, industry pricing was entirely the domain of people who wanted to just do math, because nobody thought that like anyone would ever think about implementing this. And so there is this older literature about like what happens in a city when you price its roads. And the basic idea is that it should become denser, right? That we, and I think this is intuitive, that we have subsidized movement outside of a city because you can go to places where land costs are a little lower and then not pay in money costs to get back into where the jobs are. And so we penalize central city living by imposing a congestion burden on it. One of the things that manifests as a result of that is people in the central city, they don't want development, they worry about traffic, etc. If you price the road, you should see, in general, more housing, etc., built in those priced areas. Has this happened? Well, I mean, London's a bad example because like the entire congestion charged area in London is like historically preserved, so you can't like knock it down and rebuild it at a higher density. Singapore is a reasonable example. Super dense city, traffic moves quickly, they have less trouble building. They're also kind of an autocratic government, so that's a confounding variable. I think that, so intuitively what you would expect, right, is that it becomes easier to build in these places that have higher access to opportunities. Empirically, we don't know. Yeah. Oh, so I said I'd go to you and then I'll go to the back. I'm sorry, I don't mean to neglect the back. It's, yeah.
Sure. Could you talk about how congestion pricing in downtown based on time of day is paid differently than freeway congestion pricing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of cities are more drawn to these downtown cordons. I think there's more examples of them. London did it, Stockholm did it, Milan did it. I think the two big differences to discuss very quickly are that it's politically easier, right? Like if LA says it wants to do that, it just needs permission from the state and it's just doing it in LA. Whereas like once you start saying you're going to do a network, you have multiple cities involved, etc. That being said, it's probably logistically harder because there's so many more ways to enter that charged area. The nice thing about a freeway is that it's limited access. If you draw a cordon around a downtown, like you got to make sure that every single entrance to that area is somehow tolled. But the third and the biggest difference is conceptual, which is usually like what you want out of it, right? When you want to price a freeway to reduce congestion, usually you say like, I want this road to always be moving 45 to 55 miles an hour. This is a road that's designed with one purpose, which is moving traffic relatively quickly. That's what I want it to do. If you price it downtown to reduce congestion, presumably your goal is not to let people drive really fast through your downtown, right? It's more to just sort of say, and I think London's a great example of this. They put a price on their downtown, but not so that people would just like be able to roar around in it. It was to prove to their residents that they could fight congestion. And that gave them breathing room to do a lot of other things, which is like put in bus-only lanes, expand their sidewalks, expand their bicycle lane network. So on the freeways, the goal is like sort of immediate. It's just like make the traffic move faster. Hopefully in a downtown, the goal is a two-step, right? Which is that you demonstrate to your voters that you're not going to snarl everybody in congestion. And then you can actually move forward with building an environment that's more appropriate for like a multimodal place. Yes.
So in California in 2010, I think they passed Prop 26, which requires a 2/3 vote to pass a new fee.
Mm-hmm.
How do we pass congestion pricing in California with something like that?
I think the way they're doing it, the first question is I'm probably the wrong person to answer that. But the way they're moving toward it is they are getting there's a bill that's failed last year and is moving through Sacramento again to get the special exemption to do a pilot project of road pricing. And then I think they're going to have a lot of attorneys argue over whether this is actually a fee that falls under that proposition. It's California. Yeah.
Well, it is 12:30
Okay.
now, and you have another class coming in, so thank you.
You're welcome.
So much we need to be doing. Totally Meister! I just saw Ted yesterday and now he's